Hello, everyone. Today we're going to talk about Angel Island on the West Coast. First, we're going to start about Asian immigration. Asians came to the United States to strike it rich, specifically because they heard of the California Gold Rush. The largest group was Chinese people. 300,000 arrived between 1850 and 1883. Here's a picture of Chinese immigrants on their way to the United States. Many Chinese were hired by railroad companies, paid much less than white workers. After railroads were finished, many became farmers, worked in mines, or became domestic service, such as butlers and maids. Japanese immigration to the United States increased in 1898 when the U.S. annexed or took control of the Hawaiian Islands. Many Japanese moved to Hawaii to work on plantations in 1884. When Hawaii became part of the U.S., they moved to California because of higher wages. In 1907, there were 30,000 Japanese that arrived on the West Coast. But by 1920, more than 200,000 Japanese lived on the West Coast. Here's a picture of Japanese immigrants in Hawaii. So, Angel Island, which is the West Coast version of Ellis Island, but you will see it is very different. Most West Coast immigrants were from uh, San Francisco Bay in California. Here's a picture of Angel Island. Immigrants often spent weeks or months waiting to be granted entry. Some even waited years in dirty living conditions, which is very different from Ellis Island, where people waited 2, 3, or 4 days. 18% of Asian immigrants were denied entry at Angel Island, and most were Chinese. Again, this is different from Ellis Island, where a much smaller amount were denied entry. Immigrants at Angel Island were asked more questions and had to be more specific in their answers. Different from Ellis Island, they had to have American witnesses or family members come to Angel Island to support their responses. This made it very difficult for immigrants who arrived on the West Coast to be granted entry into the United States. And here's a certificate of residence given to a Chinese immigrant. Here we have a picture, and above the men it says Daniel Declaration of Independence. And it says, for 20 years, no more Chinese laborers shall come to the United States, and no court shall admit Chinese to citizenship. And then you have the two men talking, saying, which color is to be tabooed next? If the Yankee Congress can keep the yellow man out, what is to hinder them from calling us green and then keeping us out too? So many white Americans believed Asians were taking their jobs because they would work for lower wages. This should sound familiar to people who have been paying attention to the immigration debates. So, this led to the Chinese Exclusion Act of 1882, the only law to restrict immigrants from coming to the United States. It specifically restricted Chinese immigration for 10 years. In 1892, the law was extended 10 more years. And then in 1902, the law was extended without an end date. It was not repealed until 1943, which meant for 61 years, Chinese people could not immigrate to the United States. And here we have an affidavit or supporting documents asking the courts to allow this Chinese man into the United States and give him citizenship. So we saw more discrimination. In school systems in San Francisco, they segregated Japanese children by putting them in separate schools in 1906. This made the Japanese government furious. President Theodore Roosevelt, who is pictured here, made a deal with the Japanese government. This agreement is called the Gentleman's Agreement. And from 1907 to 1908, Japan limited the number of unskilled Japanese that left the country. And then the United States agreed to repeal school segregation in San Francisco to allow them to attend school with white children. So now we talk about Mexican immigration. Before Texas, Arizona, New Mexico, California, Nevada, and Colorado joined the United States, they were all a part of Mexico. The Mexicans living in those states suddenly became citizens and residents of the United States when the United States took it over. Since they were residents of Mexico, they often spoke either English or other indigenous languages. So, their first language was Spanish. These citizens will later be targeted by the government for deportation in the early 1900s. We'll talk about that a little later on. So then we have Mexican immigrants who wanted to find work and earn higher wages than in Mexico. They also wanted to escape some political unrest. By 1930, 700,000 Mexican immigrants entered the United States. But unlike Asian immigrants, they did not have to go through Ellis Island or Angel Island. So here's a Mexican immigrant traveling to the United States in 1912. In 1902, the National Reclamation Act created new farmland in the southwestern United States. Many Mexicans came to the U.S. to work as manual laborers, cattle herders, and cartmen. And at this time, it was very easy for Mexican citizens to walk into the United States, work, then walk back home. It was pretty legal. And for many years, many Mexicans did this, worked in the United States, and lived in Mexico. So that is all for today. I will see you in the next video.